people, it's
Crate video.
Are you feeling me?
Crate fans.
I'm feeling you.
What's going on with these crates? The Ratchet & Clank series has experienced serious drift in their sensibilities to platforming, storytelling, action tone, the works, but most of the core gameplay components established back in 2002 are still adhered to in the latest titles. But, crates man, how did they land on this and why did they stick around? Get some coffee in you. We're going in deep on this one. Ratchet & Clank 1 was a transitional platformer. During development of Spyro, Insomniac Games' previous franchise, they very much saw themselves making a collectathon game, so open-ended non-linear levels, sparse story which advances after you unlock X many of the main collectible. In Spyro's case, that was stuff like freeing dragons. You get it. During the development of Ratchet, however, they deliberately did not want to make a collectathon kind of game. So, the story is no longer locked behind us collecting stuff, it's locked to proximity to script triggers. Once we walk into a certain position on the map, a cutscene will play and give us a new planet to visit. To get to the next piece of story in Ratchet, you move from A to B. There's some non-linearity here and there and branching paths, but the minute-to-minute experience is much more on rails than the case was for Spyro. There is a lot of Spyro in Ratchet, but the progression layout for the story and the minute-to-minute activities in the games feel like they owe much more to Crash Bandicoot. Specifically the first one, the one with the linear level unlock path. Crash was a transitional platformer as well, but he was a 5th gen platformer, so the transition in question was the shift from 2D over to 3D. Ratchet is a 6th gen platformer, so the transition was from platforming to action and away from goofy cartoony contexts over to fully fleshed out stories with emotional arcs and stuff. Now I promise you that this is all deeply relevant to understanding crates. There's no padding here. What you often see happening in transitional titles is a bunch of wild new ideas being toyed around with within a framework which feels very, very familiar. For Crash Bandicoot, Naughty Dog was just aping Donkey Kong Country and Sonic and Mario, and those levels had short levels, which could be very hard because that's how things used to work back in the arcades. So Crash has short levels, which are very, very hard. Also, because levels actually ate up a lot of memory, so they needed to maximize the value of the space, and having the player die often and have to retry a 30-second sequence maybe 10 times to get it perfect got you a lot of bang for your bits. What Crash and Spyro and the other 5th gen platformers would pioneer would largely be considered fundamentals during the development of the Ratchet games, so a lot of the 5th gen stuff just made its way into Ratchet organically. But the 6th generation's platformers brought to the table a lot of changes as well, like bigger maps, fewer loading screens, smoother animations, many more. But for crates, bigger maps. Let's focus on that. Bigger maps in Ratchet means you don't need the player to die as often as you do in a Crash Bandicoot game. Ratchet's games don't have that arcadey sensibility where you try the same thing over and over again and get so good at it that you can do it in 1 minute flat. So the way you conceptualize of the player in the space and what their mindset will be during playtime is fundamentally very different in Ratchet to how it was for Crash. Bigger maps in Ratchet means you don't need the player to die as often. Ratchet's games don't have that arcadey sensibility where you try the same thing over and over again and get so good at it that you can do it in 1 minute flat. So the way you conceptualize of the player in the space and what their mindset will be during playtime is fundamentally different in Ratchet to how it was for a game like Crash. Ratchet's level lengths are more comparable to Spyro's, but the main objective is more in line with Crash. Get from A to B. Because Crash was a 5th gen game, the player had to worry about getting Wampa fruits to get 1-ups so they wouldn't get a game over screen. Because Ratchet is a 6th gen game, the player does not need to worry about game overing. Instead, they're on the grind for money, to unlock more and better equipment, and instead of the high stakes, high reward game of Crash, engagement is carried with the story and the joy of exploring and discovering this strange universe. Crash's levels get mileage from being... Shh. Cat. Crash's levels get their mileage from being replayed very often. Ratchet's levels get their mileage from having you stop and enter combat sequences a lot. In very deep, fundamental ways, these two franchises are different, but they both have crates. And whether Insomniac actually lifted the idea of crates from Crash or not, they solve for a lot of the same problems in both series. Crash Bandicoot has crates because the developers could not fit more enemies into the levels, but they still needed something for the player to hit. As a crate appreciator, I was blown back a bit when I learned this because I feel the crates are so fundamental to Crash's identity that I thought surely the combat system, such as it is, would have been optimized around the crates first and foremost, but no, the crates were born during development. In both series, the crates act as clutter. Something the developers can plop into the levels to give the player something cheap and fun to interact with. Something the player can throw themselves and the combat mechanics against, and which can mask the artificiality of the space they inhabit by making the actual scenery be interactable. You can't break the background here, but seeking platforms, holes you can fall into, and yes, breakable crates, lend the environment a sense of being real because they respond to us. This isn't a clutter video, but boy would that be fun. But on the gradient of clutter and decoration, so stuff we interact with versus the space interactions take place in, crates are definitely clutter in both series. Crash has metal crate platforms every now and then, which are really just there so that you have something to walk on, but overwhelmingly both series lean more into crates as clutter. And you wouldn't really want them to go the other way. You can tell quite a bit about the sensibilities of the eras these games were made in by looking at the crates in these games, because the way they're slotted into the levels and the functions they actually serve are the same and different. So Crash has nitro crates to instantly kill Crash. Ratchet does not, because it's not an arcadey die and retry the whole thing game. Crash has 1-up crates, because it is a die and retry the whole thing game. Ratchet has ammo crates because it's an action game. In Crash Bandicoot, crates often serve as the actual platforms we have to use to get around. Ratchet never makes that mandatory. Crash has bounce crates. Both have metal crates, but Ratchet's are breakable. Crash's standard crates have Wampa fruits, which give 1-ups. Ratchet's standard crates have bolts, which you use to buy guns, gadgets, ammo, and info. These are different series with different design ethoses, so the way they utilize something as seemingly simple as a crate is actually quite different. And dare I say, interesting. To me at least, I think this stuff is very interesting. The Ratchet series seems to have its levels and combat encounters and crate placements and everything else, really, be tuned around bombast and flow. There are faster sequences, there are slower sequences, but the games really want you to keep moving at a cracking pace, blowing away everything in your path. So, the reason we don't have unbreakable metal crates in Ratchet is because Ratchet is a power fantasy, and it's not powerful to not be able to break those kinds of crates. No crate in Ratchet is allowed to waste time, and having to retry an area because the crate platform broke and you're soft-locked from progressing, that's a waste of time. In an arcadey Crash Bandicoot it's fine because those levels are so short. In Ratchet, every crate needs to be destructible to not undermine the power fantasy, or the game covers promise that you'll be ripping the galaxy a new one. But the structure of the levels and their length means soft locks are not okay, and so progress here can never be locked behind a specific crate not being broken. Crash had a more dedicated all-or-nothing sensibility, arcade style, but Ratchet's levels are too long for that attitude, and the momentum of the action is seemingly too sacred to allow for the player to have their time wasted like that. I'm familiar enough with the OG PlayStation 2 titles to say that this rule is abided by in all of them, and even though I'm not as familiar with the later games, I can't easily recall a scenario where this rule was not followed. Certainly there are times when the games punish the player for breaking crates, like in Ratchet 2, where we had those ambush sections which activated when we broke the health crates. I love that sequence, by the way, but I really can't recall the developers ever punishing the player for breaking crates by making them retry the section. Also, I say we're being punished with the health crates in that Ratchet 2 section, and for the first time, yes, but after we've triggered the trap once, you know what to expect from the inconspicuously placed health crates. And those aren't just health crates, those are the upgraded purple health crates, which drop more health. So if you're low on health and you like your odds, maybe you choose to break it and enter the gauntlet to try to stack the odds in your favor somewhat. If there's one thing separating Crash Bandicoot's crates and Ratchet's crates, it's this. Crates in Ratchet do not factor into the platforming. Crates in Ratchet are combat variables. Which means a brief primer on the combat is in order. Ratchet's combat succeeds, I would argue, primarily because it integrates the platforming into it. So the enemy layouts follow the style established in Spyro, where there's usually a few big guys surrounded by a lot of small guys. The big guys here all have weapons, but the small guys usually just run around and try to bite Ratchet. The big guys die in 2 to 3 hits, the small guys usually die in 1. When you enter a combat encounter, the big guys will fire at Ratchet, and they fire very slow-moving projectiles, which you're absolutely able to maneuver your way around. While you make your way to the big guys, who usually stay somewhat stationary, the small guys will try to overwhelm you. There's a lot of emphasis on placement here, and you are being nudged into approaching combat as an obstacle course. The weapons enemies have are all ways of creating environmental hazards, and if you play well, you actually can platform your way perfectly around taking any damage. In the Ratchet sections, at least. Giant Clank, I think, will always take a bit of damage. Crates can be climbed, they can be used to get height, to make longer jumps possible, but the way you interact with them, 99% of the time, is to attack them. Ironically enough, the only times you really find yourself wanting to hold back from attacking them is in the actual combat sequences, because sometimes you need some cover and you can use those crates to shield yourself. Because crates absorb attacks. They break when those attacks land, but aside from some very unique instances, when an enemy fires a weapon and the shot, or rocket, or bomb, hits a crate, the shot, or rocket or bomb, will be destroyed and its splash damage effect, if it had any, will trigger. So if you desperately need cover in the middle of a firefight, crates can be your friends, momentarily. If you need cover, it's either because you're currently a bit overwhelmed by the enemies and need to resituate yourself, or because you're low on health. In the case of the latter, the health crates are your friend, and you will from time to time find yourself ignoring the combat, or maneuvering your way around it to beeline over to a health crate. The same effect can be created with the ammo crates, but those moments are rarer, I feel, probably because ammo is just more plentiful than health is. Still, sometimes you really run out and need to quickly get some added firepower. Every crate can best be understood by studying the contexts we find them in and how they are utilized. I think it's obvious why ammo and health crates would be combat coded, but like I said earlier, the primary means of interacting with crates is with the combat mechanics, not the platforming ones. And that applies to all crates. Outside of combat, crates give us a free target to attack. I think the bombast vibe of Ratchet is actually really improved by the crates because they're a safe enemy, in quotation marks enemy, which can't hurt us, so we get a free shot in to feel like a big guy. And also, lowering the danger from an attack target to 0, by just having that attack target be a crate, gives the developers the means to pace out the bombast vibe somewhat. If the player just took out an arena full of enemies, the developers can drop them into a room filled with only crates to both reward them and let them vent and go all out in safety. And then maybe that venting sequence mentally gets glued to the combat sequence which happened just before it and gives that sequence a big payoff. You fought 7 enemies and capped it off by breaking an entire room full of crates. That's gonna probably feel really empowering. The combat sequences usually take place in fairly open spaces. I figure that's because of the enemy pathfinding maybe not being great with clutter, and because Ratchet's own weapons might not be the best if they had to move around a bunch of crates and geometry like that. The effect of those open spaces is often to make them feel quite artificial and empty, so clutter like light posts or benches and such are usually dropped in and are breakable for some bolts, but crates are the standard way in which an empty area is filled up. We don't have many combat sequences taking place in an area brimming with crates, and that's likely a byproduct of how crates absorb attacks. It might be cool conceptually to drop the player in an area or room filled with crates and then have them jump around while enemies funnel into the room and attack the player, but if the effect of that is that the aim assist wastes our shots on crates, and instead of the crates acting as a satisfying reward, they just gradually break over the course of the firefight, I don't think it would feel all so good. I actually think it would be better to reverse things and drop Ratchet in a room full of enemies, which afterwards will have a bunch of crates dropping. My favorite way in which crates are utilized in combat is exclusive to Ratchet 1. There were times when enemies would be placed inside of crates, and once you approached them, they would break out. It happened with the Blarg troopers on Hoven, and the Norks in the Nebula space station. For keeping the player constantly on their toes, and for quickly shifting the mental scheme the player is applying to the situation in front of them, these crates are great. But they might not be the best for the intended experience, which is why they maybe got dropped. In reality, I think they were probably just dropped because they maybe were just, a bit too much of a hassle to code, but if there was a game design philosophy reason behind this, it might be that they betray the player's expectations and make them second-guess themselves and their instincts for how to read crates. And in that case, the developers maybe found that subsequent sequences where they tried to use the crates to communicate something to the player had to go through a filter of the player's uncertainty, and in practice, it just meant that the crates became a bit less reliable. I'm not so sure about that because I don't recall ever shying away from a crate on the suspicion that it might be a secret enemy mimic crate, but if there was any design philosophy behind the removal of the crates, this is the best I can figure. That, or maybe the players just felt disappointed by seeing a big stack of crates and then not being able to break it for the big cash moolah inside. Even if the enemies inside the crates were coded to drop extra bolts to make up the difference, and I don't know if they were or not, even if they were though, I think it would still not feel nearly as good because there's an intrinsic reward to breaking a large stack of crates and gobbling up the monies. The crates have a real feeling of heft. There's a good crunchiness to breaking them. The bolt pickup sound was consciously inspired by the noises of a casino. There's a weight to the breaking, a heftiness to the action. It feels really good to physically break the crates, and this nudges a player into actually breaking as many stacks of crates as they can see, and during development of Crack in Time, they actually needed to formalize a document governing the do's and do nots about crate placements because they found that there were too many crates, and because the playtesters always wanted to break all of them, eventually it got fatiguing. It was in hearing this tidbit when I was streaming that Ratchet GGC talk a while back where the idea behind this video originally came to me. I've actually tried to get in touch with Brian Hastings about getting to see this document, but to no avail. So if you, dear viewer, by any chance are an Insomniac employee, if you see the guy walking around, maybe float him the idea, share the crate document with the world wants to see the crate document, That said, this video focuses on crates in the original PlayStation 2 trilogy, so it wouldn't ultimately be of as much use to me, but I think the lesson learned in these games must have surely informed it to some extent. Initially, I was going to replay these games to try to reverse engineer the document by seeing what the devs did and did not do. But then I got more into the esoterics behind box placement here and applications, and found that there really isn't a lot of hard and fast rules other than the ones I've discussed so far. And they aren't always adhered to perfectly, so I figured the level designers must have had some discretion when it actually came to crate placements. Compare a level like Iridia in Ratchet 1 to a level like Metropolis in Ratchet 1, and it feels like two different designers had two very different conceptualizations for what the best applications of the crates was. Those levels do play differently, so fair enough that crates would be used differently, but it makes me think there wasn't a lot of hard-nosed rule following or theory crafting with the crates as much as it maybe was just vibed out. I might be wrong about that, but I've never found any detailed talk about crate rules prior to Crack in Time, so I'm assuming it was vibes based, and that if there was any sort of crate rules document prior to Crack in Time, I think it must have probably grown organically from what the developers found was the best practices when they had experimented with placing crates, rather than them having sat down and decided upon what the best practices should be, and then optimizing the crates to try to best present that. There are some ironclad rules governing the crates which are adhered to, but they mostly apply to the actual design of the crates themselves rather than their implementations in the levels. This is stuff the developers would have had discussions about. Any slight change regarding the fundamental parameters and utilities of crates, any such change made late in development, requires that every instance of crates in the game be retested and examined to make sure that the sequence hasn't been ruined. The most important feature the crates share, I would argue, is their dimensions. Each crate is only a tad shorter than Ratchet, and it's a right cube where every side is the same length. This is important because Ratchet can let's grab on crates. And I think the reason the crates are just a bit shorter than Ratchet is so that Ratchet cannot let's grab on a single crate, but if one is stacked on top of another one, he can let's grab on that crate. Another characteristic the crates share, excluding the metal crate and later the Inferno mode crate, is that they all have 1 health and take universal damage. That is, they break in 1 hit from Ratchet and from the enemies. You wouldn't want to kill Momentum Dead by making the player smack the same crate over and over again, so 1 health makes sense for the crates, and you wouldn't want to betray their characterization as breakable clutter by having enemy fire not affected, so universal damage also makes sense. The crates all having the same dimensions means they can be slotted in the same positions as any other crate, and they can be swapped in and out seamlessly. It also means that level designers only ever needed to keep the 1 number in mind when figuring out where crates would be. Numeric standardization like this early in development saves a lot of time on the back end, because the more decisions you tack on to a primary one, like crate dimensions, the more everything gets shuffled around if you alter it, and the more you need to fix everything around the crate. So the least interesting things, like crate dimensions, often turn out to be the most important things to get right early in development. Here's another creative call which affects the best practices of crate placements in the game, whether or not the developers ever thought about this. Crates break individually. Stacks do not have a stack code where if you smack 1 crate in a stack, the whole stack breaks with it. Each crate needs to physically be broken. For a game all about bombast, you'd think they'd consider going for the opposite approach, so if the player's wrench were to slightly clip the edge of a single crate in a stack, every crate in that stack would break, but nope, they didn't. Here's another interesting creative call. Bolts don't care about taking damage. In Crash Bandicoot, if you attack a Wampa Fruit, or if it lands in the blast radius of an explosive, it will fly off the map. In Ratchet, the bolts don't care about the damage taking place near them. And in fact, if you throw your wrench at them from a distance, they will not only not fly away, they will magnetize to Ratchet. A lot of these creative calls I'm talking about are not necessarily something that was ever actually thought about, but the fact that one implementation was made rather than another still affects what utilization of the crates will feel best to interact with. And if there's anything behind the bolts don't take damage quote-unquote creative call, it's likely just that Ratchet is all about explosive action, and if the explosive action made the bolts fly away, players would be disincentivized to pursue the explosive action. Here's something counterintuitive about games development. You'd think that the big moments in these games are where you really want to dedicatedly work your craft, because those are the big moments, but the inverse is actually true. However good a boss is, the player will only fight it once. However good a cutscene is, the player will only watch it once per playthrough. But the fundamental stuff is what players will come into contact with over and over again. In Ratchet & Clank, you very likely are going to be breaking thousands of crates. If a boss sucks, the game has one bad boss. If the cutscene sucks, the game's gonna have one bad cutscene, but if the crates suck, the game will suck. Ratchet's crates most certainly do not suck. The first game had normal bolt crates, explosive crates, health crates, ammo crates, and metallic bolt crates. Ratchet might have been a transitional platformer, but it did come out fully formed in many ways, and the testament to the strong crate lineup here is that these are still the core crates used in later titles. The metallic bolt crate was dropped in subsequent games, bafflingly, but the others are still very much the core crates. The normal bolt crates just have bolts in them, nothing too fancy. The explosive crates blow up after their timer has been set off, and they also drop some bolts. The explosion damages everybody near it, so crates, Ratchet, enemies, anybody in the blast radius. The health crates drop precious nanotech. The relevance of these crates is massively diminished after the first game because Ratchet's health levels up by killing enemies and the checkpoints become much more forgiving. The ammo crates drop ammo. There's some player assistance mixed into these ones because they're coded to prioritize the weapons you've been using most recently. The metallic bolt crates are exactly the same as the regular bolt crates, except they don't break unless they are hit with some sort of explosive, or the Walloper boxing glove weapon. Other crates in the series include the Inferno mode crate, the Bolt multiplier crate, and, I would argue, the crystals. The Inferno mode crate is a gimmicky timed infinite health insta-kill mode, which Ratchet can unlock by breaking special crates in the third game. I don't really like these, and I think they detract from the superior way of playing the game. Running around trying to wrench enemies is nowhere near as fun as the action platforming is. I do kinda like how they drop in the Annihilation Nation Gladiator Arena, because in the impossible challenge there often pops up an indestructible turret which will try to kill Ratchet, but they also spawn these crates in the arena and they don't take universal damage. They only break if Ratchet breaks them, so if you don't feel like running around the arena and dodging machine gun fire, you can just casually stand behind an Inferno mode crate and shoot the enemies from a distance. The Bolt multiplier crate is another gimmicky Ratchet 3 crate, and it doubles bolt pickups. I've got nothing more to say about this one. The crystals, however, I quite like. So, no, these are not crates in the conventional sense. The whole talk I just had about universal crate dimensions, throw that out the window. But I still think the crystals are warranted bringing up in the crate discussion video, because a lot of the applications of crates applies to the crystals as well. In Ratchet 2 and 3, we get collectathon levels, where we scour maps for these crystals which we need to break to collect. The crystals can be turned in for bolts, so I figure you could conceive of the crystals as very lucrative crates. The big difference between the crystals in the caves is that the crystals sell for quite a lot more than the crates drop, and, more importantly, the crystals don't break in one hit. I figure the reason for that is to ensure that we need to actually stop to break the crystals, which gives the surrounding enemies time to spawn in and attack us. By locking the crystal behind the time it takes for us to break it open, the devs get us to actually engage with the combat sequence they set up. I like it. It's a bit like the special health crates from Ratchet 2 I talked about earlier, the ones which spawn the electric wall gauntlet if broken, in that these are, mostly, optional breakables which have a unique combat sequence coded around them. The approach to breaking them is changed to make the sequence land and play out, but the sequence is quite well designed and integrated into the game, leans well into the strengths of the core gameplay. Aside maybe for how insanely aggressive everything on Planet Gralvin is. But aside from that, collectible crystals. I'm a fan. They even had these super duper enemies in the collectathon levels which drop crystals when killed. But that's not really relevant to the crate video, now is it? Crate dimension deliberation might not sound very sexy, but if you want to make an impact on a game, this is probably the conversation you want to be in rather than the nitty-gritty of hand placing each crate in the levels. There is a lot of artistry there too, which we're about to get to, but that artistry is restrained by the parameters and operations of the crates which the nerdier talk decides. So far, we've discussed how the crates work. We've discussed where they might have come from. We've discussed what they're probably tuned for. Now, let's talk the artistry of crate placement. Like I said earlier, in playtesting, Insomniac found over and over again that players want to break crates when they see them. If the player's instincts when they see a crate is to break it, how do you utilize them? Well, For one, you can use crates to telegraph spaces. If the player sees a crate on the other side of a gap, they know that they can make their way to the other side, and it might actually be enough to have them exit an area in such a way that the camera kind of organically faces the crate on the other side of that gap to communicate to the player that that is their intended heading. You can also do this for the optional stuff. If you want to leave a hint for the player that they can shimmy around to a secret area to get a special bolt, it's usually enough to just have some inconspicuously placed crates there to draw the player's eye. Here's something else the impulse to break every crate means. A crate can reroute the player. This is a small, but, I think, significant thing. The player has a heading, they're going there, but then they see a stack of crates to the side and they change their angle a bit so that they can nap those bolts and then route back to the original path. In the short term, this might just sound a bit tedious, but I think the genius of this is revealed when you look at these games on an hour-to-hour basis. I can only speak for myself here, but after playing any title for that long, I always find myself drifting out a bit. I cannot disassociate from the activity in front of me, and I become very aware of the structure organizing the activity. So minute to minute, the stimuli becomes kind of predictable, and it no longer feels like I'm fighting enemies as much as it feels like I'm clearing out a room which gates the next piece of content. The crate-created rerouting, I think, is significant because in some small way it might combat this. Because it breaks up the potential feeling of monotony when you're constantly finding yourself having your linear, pre-planned path broken up, and it doesn't necessarily set in how small the Ratchet gameplay loop really is. Another way the smallness of the gameplay loop is kept from becoming monotonous is with how often the game radically shifts tones, and the crates help to do this. They add an activity to perform, and if you place a crate room in between, say, two combat rooms, I think it actually helps stretch time a bit in the player's head, because if the combat sequences happened back to back, they might merge together and feel like one drawn-out sequence. But by placing the crate room in between them, it's three distinct activities, one after another. Combat sequence, crate breaking sequence, combat sequence. And crates add life to any area they're dropped in. If we rewind the video a bit, you'll recall me saying that in Crash Bandicoot, crates were born from the need to add more targets for the player to attack once the developers found themselves hitting a wall with how many enemies the game could feasibly have in a given level. I'm assuming Ratchet crates are also cheaper to render than Ratchet enemies. I've seen them do a room with like 50 crates, but I've never seen them do a room with 50 enemies, so I'm assuming the crates are cheaper to render than the enemies, and so the utility of crates as added combat targets is obvious. But clutter is also important. Going back to what I said earlier about how backgrounds are static and having things like enemies and breakable clutter to interact with in the levels masks the artificially constructed space, consider that crates are both attack targets and clutter. They just work on every level. And as breakable clutter, they're super generic looking enough that the same model can be used in every level, and it allows the artists to have a lot of stuff for the player to break without having to create a lot of unique breakable clutter assets, and it ensures that these breakable clutter objects, the crates, are legible as such to the player. The transition from the 5th generation platformers to the 6th generation ones was interesting, and this crate talk was cut from a much larger video I'm making covering that transition. It talks about Spyro, Crash, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet, and Sly Cooper. The crate detour ended up being a bit too much, so I felt like I'd dust off the old crate design talk video I had intended to make way back and put this sequence to work there. Not to pimp the 5th to 6th gen PlayStation platformer transition video too much here, but it gets really nitty-gritty into esoteric stuff like this. The way crates helped the transition be made is that crates are tied both into the action and the platforming very organically. I don't know when that video will be completed. It seems to just get more and more expansive with every line I write, but seeing as it's cracking the 3-hour mark now, I figure it'll be some time before I can put it out here. Probably the Silent Hill 4 commentaries should come first, eh? If you enjoy videos like this one and want to support me making them directly, consider joining the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. I try to do monthly releases on YouTube, but whenever I have something available early, I like to drop it there for members to watch. I have some Esoteric From Software theme videos coming down the pipeline. They're kinda like that hidden horrors of Silent Hill video I made, and I'm dutifully chipping away at the Silent Hill 4 commentary. So if you want to see any of those, be sure to check out the Patreon. Aside from that, if you want to, you can show the video some love with all the little YouTube bips and bobs. So like the video, comment, and all that jazz. There's the channel Discord server if you want to have more in-depth conversations about the videos, or you want to see whether the rumors are true and I am indeed the greatest chef on the North Atlantic. Many things. All of these things are linked in the description box below. Description crate below. Until next time, take care. Bigger maps in Ratchet means you don't need the player to die as... Hey cat, be quiet. I'm talking about crates. This is crate video, cat. Cat! Cat!